So we sort of have two objectives with this session. And one is to think and to talk about how we incorporate soil health into new ag land protection projects. Is that just conversations with landowners? Is it thinking about differences in easement language and changes in easement language? Is it thinking about how to use conservation and or management plans to encourage, incentivize, support producers and landowners wanting to do more on the conservation front? So that's sort of the major part of this. The second piece of it is sort of how do you engage landowners and folks on protected land if they have a conservation plan, particularly is that a way that you can use to engage people around conversations around soil health? So that's the discussion for this morning. Let me quickly do intros because we have a number of people joining us. Chris Gutenschritter, who is now Director of the Land Conservation Law Program at Gathering Waters, which is the Wisconsin-based Land Trust Coalition. He led a collaborative project to draft a model conservation easement in Wisconsin when he was a consultant to Gathering Waters. And prior to this, Chris was Director of Land Conservation and Stewardship at Tall Pines Conservancy in Wisconsin. Then we have Allison Volk. Allison is Madison, Wisconsin based. She is AFT's Deputy Land Project Director. She does a lot of our easement acquisition and donation work. And before she came to AFT, she was with the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection in Wisconsin, or DATCAP as we call it, 5 years of which she ran the farmland preservation program there. We then have two folks joining us from the Minnesota Land Trust. Jocelyn Walters Hurd, who is the senior staff attorney, and so in that role she drafts and reviews all the components of MLT's real estate transactions. She was previously a litigator for the City of Chicago's Law Department. That strikes me as a crazy job. One of these days we'll talk about that, Jocelyn. And then Chad Kingstrom is Minnesota Land Trust Conservation Program Manager, focused on the southwest part of the state, and has been deeply involved in a project that they are going to talk about later, where AFT has been helping as well. And lastly, Jean Brokish, also here, is AFT's Midwest Deputy Director. Before joining AFT, she spent 11 years leading a conservation and outreach programs for Oahu RC&D. That sounds like a pretty wonderful job in my book, but included oversight for multiple watershed implementation projects. So she's got a lot of experience on the conservation planning front. She's also worked as a conservation technician for a soil and water conservation district in Ohio. So let me preface this conversation by saying that I know that everybody in this group, that all of the agencies and land trusts have a slightly different approach to using easement language, using conservation plans, using management plans to address resource concerns and conservation values. And so I put in the polls for this, you should see two questions in the polls. And I'm hoping that everybody right now will take a minute to go to those. I don't see any polls in this.
Yeah, they're not in there. Let us get them in there real quick.
Okay, well then I'll keep talking for a minute, because we do want to get a sense of who has what kind of management plan requirements or conservation plan requirements, or thinking about easements. So let me take 5 minutes to sort of set this stage. We know that when you are doing land protection in the agricultural space, right, it's balancing the protection of the resource values and balancing sort of the need to be protecting agricultural land for agricultural production and use, and right, and that we know that it is very much of a balancing act in terms of what you want to require and not require in an easement, and then thinking about those conservation or management plans. So, right, there's sort of an option when you're thinking about a new easement, whether that's a donated easement or a purchased easement, is whether to be prescriptive in the easement language itself, and whether that's to particularly limit certain agricultural activities, either a type of activity or by location on a farm. And so we understand that this approach can work. It can also be somewhat problematic. So I think that's why there have been lots of both land trusts and public programs that, instead of trying to have prescriptive easement language, is to have a conservation plan or a management plan as a way of addressing those resource concerns and conservation values. And so probably, and this is when we get to the poll, it's sort of interesting to see who uses what, because you can have a general management plan, or there are entities that have a requirement for a grazing management plan or a forest management plan or a nutrient management plan. Like, that could be sort of stacked management plan approaches. And certainly when we look at the current ag conservation, the federal ag conservation easement program and those ALE easements, right, they require a conservation plan for highly erodible land, a grassland management plan if it is coming in under the grassland portion of ALE, or a forest management plan. So even those have multiple management plan objectives. So what we are looking to do here is to sort of think about the intersection of all of those plans. Obviously, this is a subject that I think probably all of you know well, and all of you have slightly different approaches. So we want to talk about those different approaches. We are also mindful that increasingly, both in the public agency arena and in the land trusts, that folks are wanting to do more in terms of really encouraging and promoting soil health. And so what does that look like, and how we are changing how we think about management plans or conservation plans or easement language itself. And again, folks are sort of thinking and trying new ideas, and these management plans can be getting sort of more prescriptive or more focused on soil health. And again, there's now this tension on if you have management plans that are really encouraging farmers to adopt certain regenerative ag practices or climate smart practices, where is that fine line where you can ask folks to do something versus where it is something where you feel that there needs to be additional financial compensation to a farmer or a landowner for agreeing to take on certain practices. So that's where we're going to talk about a little bit today. And we're really happy to have Jocelyn and Chad here to talk about a project that they're working on that is what we sort of consider what we call stacked conservation, in that it's an underlying easement, a management plan, and then a management contract stacked on top of those two pieces. So we're going to start this conversation with Allison and Chris and talk a little bit about easement language and use of management plans and sort of their perspectives on that. We'll then go to Jocelyn and Chad to talk about what Minnesota Land Trust is doing with a new project of theirs. We'll then have a little bit of a conversation with Jean on NRCS conservation plans and planning. And then we're going to break into groups where you have a choice of furthering the conversation about management plans with Allison and Chris, or talking with Jocelyn and Chad more about this sort of concept where We'll also be joined in that discussion group with Ben Wierzinski, the ag economist from yesterday, because he's been involved in that project with Minnesota Land Trust. And then folks who want to stay in the main room to have a conversation with Jean and myself about NRCS conservation plans. And I say all of this with knowing that all of you have a lot of experience in this. I'm looking directly at Brian, because that is Brian, with Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, you guys have been in the land protection business for a long time. You all have, I know, sort of thought long and hard about this. Is one example. There are many of you in this room similarly, but we are looking for this to be an interactive conversation, because there's no one right answer here. I think we are all continuing to struggle with what makes the most sense in thinking about management plans and easement language. So here are the polls. All right, well, this is good. So it seems like there's a little bit of everything, but that most folks require that a landowner have a conservation or management plan, which is good, because that gives us a lot to talk about on the management plan front. And then if your deed requires a landowner to have a management plan, does that plan have to be implemented? And again, it seems like folks are sort of like, some are no, some are yes, more are yes, and some are yes, but just on highly erodible land. So this is good. This gives us, and that some do not require a conservation or management plan at all, or have specific language in the easements. So this is good. We've got a good mixture of folks. So appreciate that, just in terms of giving us grounding, everybody grounding for this conversation. So now we're going to start with Allison and Chris. We're going to jump right in on talking about easements. And so I'm wondering if the two of you can talk a little bit about easement language, and how prescriptive is the AFT easement and or that model Wisconsin easement that you worked on, Chris, around conservation practices and around soil health specifically?
Go ahead, Allison.
Thanks, Chris. So the AFT easement is not very prescriptive on practices specifically. Our easement requires ag and other uses to be conducted in accordance with the management plan. So it's really providing guidance on what the plan should address. So it states that the plan needs to include practices intended to enhance soil health, but you know, it's really setting, the easement itself is really setting the minimum standards for the uses of the property, and points to the plan, which is then meant to be more fluid and updated over time.
Right. And then does the AFT language require that the management plan, that landowner be farming in conformance with the management plan?
So that's not yet. What we're kind of hoping, so we've been only doing this for maybe about a year or two, and right now our approach is to hope that the plan is something that the landowner sees as a valuable tool and wants to follow, but our easement language isn't currently requiring the landowner to actually implement the plan.
Okay. And Chris, talk to me about the Wisconsin model easement and the sort of thinking that went in behind that.
Yeah, so the Wisconsin model easement, first of all, is basically a product of compromise. It was a product of a working group of about 16 attorneys and or practitioners in the state of Wisconsin over about 18 months. And one critical decision that we made that sort of set us in a particular direction was choosing to create multiple management zones in this model. So this model is just basically an invitation to think about drafting an easement in this particular way. And what these management zones do, instead of really just having an area where all the conservation values exist and an area where all sort of improvements can exist, like what we used to call a building envelope. We created a highest protection area, standard protection area, and then a minimal protection area. And the purpose of that was to sort of invite the drafters and invite the land trust to really think about their conservation values in a more focused manner. Now, so that was sort of how we chose to encourage maybe a slightly more prescriptive approach to achieving conservation outcomes, soil health outcomes, for example, on properties. And then furthermore, some of those folks who were in that working group were representatives of funding partners, for example. DNR was there, some other funding partners were there. So they had a very strong voice for these different types of management plans, which Chris sort of spelled out at the beginning. So you'll see in the Wisconsin model easement that there's like a forest management plan, there's a natural resource management plan, there are all these different management plans that are given names in that model easement. So we've deferred to those management plans, similar to what AFT has done, and really just focused our easement language on guidance around what needs to be included in those management plans in the model easement.
Right. Okay. Do you have, and I know, Chris, that we talked about this earlier, you talked about a project while you were at Tall Pines where you actually did put in sort of slightly more prescriptive easement language. Do you want to talk about that and that approach and why you went that route?
Yeah, so it kind of comes, that concept was at Tall Pines was kind of born out of the realization that we were doing all this water quality related work, and yet our easements weren't necessarily directly addressing that head on. And so we had a project come to us that it was agricultural land, and there was a portion of that land that was highly erodible soils, and it was very, very close to surface water. And the community knew, and we knew, that that land is likely largely responsible for at least a portion of the water quality issues. So this project happened where it was a land slated for development. It was going to be 54 homes, I think, something like that. And we got involved, and we structured a deal with a conservation buyer to buy that land, place a conservation easement on it. Well, that buyer wasn't really interested in having a management plan. So in the tool that we used to use to sort of put a little leverage on them to get soil health outcomes, water quality outcomes, wasn't very appealing to this person who was about to put up 7 figures to buy this land. And so we had to come up with an idea of how we could achieve those outcomes outside of a management plan. So that was sort of our first foray into using more prescriptive language in the easement, where what we did was identify those highly erodible soils specifically within the easement language. We had provisions designed to require not so much certain practices, but certain outcomes of practices. So for example, permanent vegetative cover. If you chose to graze it, that's fine. If you chose to, have a perennial harvestable crop, that's fine. But it needed to remain in permanent vegetative cover on that 6% or greater highly erodible soil. So where in the past we had liked to put that type of language in the management plan, we actually opted to place it in the easement.
Great. Okay, that's helpful to know. So thinking about easement language, and Allison and I have had long conversations about this, and that AFT generally is very reluctant to be prescriptive in easement language, because again, we think of it as a sort of perpetuity document, and given everything that could change, the sort of being prescriptive. But as I throw out this question because it's been one I have been thinking about, is that if the goal is to try and encourage sort of better soil health, what is, and I know that there have been land trusts that have gone that are quite prescriptive in their easement language, that talk about either that something needs to be grazed, something's not going to be cropped. But what about an approach of saying that a piece of farm ground needs to have X% organic matter? And I don't even know, this isn't Bianca, we've never really talked about this, but in terms of sort of, could you put in an easement something that says this land has to have either a certain minimum amount of organic matter, or have that's why I asked the question yesterday about aggregate stability. If aggregate stability is more important than organic matter, what is there a value to saying that in an easement? And I asked that first of Chris and Allison, but I would be very interested in hearing anybody else's thoughts and whether you all have thought about that, or toyed with going that route. That is something that is what can you put in that's sort of easy to measure, that is not prescriptive, but that seems to be one way to do it. And I'm just curious, Allison and Chris, your thoughts, and then anybody else's thoughts.
Yeah, we'd be hesitant to include something like that, and I think because of two reasons, really. Even though it's potentially easy to measure, we are committing to it forever, right? And we know what our staff capacity is right now, but we don't know what it's going to be like after we're gone. And then the second concern that we would have is the enforcement issue. What do we do if we find out that they're not meeting certain standards?
Right. It's a good point. Yeah. Chris, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely in line with what Allison just suggested. There's an assumption built into that the best knowledge that we have to create those prescriptive provisions today will remain either the best practice or best science down the road in the future. I could imagine an easement getting written 20 years ago when no-till was sort of becoming the standard, or not the standard, but it was sort of an innovative approach to agriculture. Well, if we had just left it at no-till and made that the prescriptive measure in the easement, or for example, referencing back to what Bianca was presenting in the last session, if we just had soil health or soil organic matter as the metric, we're missing out, respiration, aggregate stability. I've got this list of things that she was rattling off. We're missing soil health really in that scenario. So this concept of perpetuity is one that I toy with a lot, but I prefer to have those things in a management plan, which can be much more flexible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So let me just throw this open to everybody else in terms of easement language. People trying different things. Anybody want to suggest a different approach of where their easement deed language is on sort of promoting soil health? All right, well, maybe that means that people are not putting and not thinking about sort of changing underlying easement language. So let's then talk a little bit more about management plans, since again, it seems like a lot of folks here are using management plans. And so Chris, I know that you have written a number of management plans. What is your approach on doing it in a way that particularly is focusing on soil health?
Let me just clarify for a second. I'm a law nerd. I'm not like I have a farming background. I have farmed, I've done it. But I'm not so egoic about my farming experience to think that I can write an effective management plan. I've been a part of writing management plans, but I've largely deferred to the experts in that field to do that work. But for me, being a law nerd, that's the lens that I look at this through. I start by looking at the conservation values of the easement. And so you have pulled out that there's a difference between future projects and past projects. And so past projects, the management plan is largely constrained by what that easement says, or what the current landowner or current operator is willing to do voluntarily and place into a management plan. That's one thing. Going forward with future projects, we can learn from past experience. And so I really like to draft requirements into the easement about basic elements of management plan. So I have to draft that language, recognizing that what I know today might not be what I know tomorrow. So I'm focusing on desired outcomes. So for example, soil organic matter, respiration, aggregate stability, everything that Bianca was talking about in the previous session, I'm really focusing on establishing that the management plan ought to be designed, first of all, written by a professional, a qualified professional. That's one standard that I always write in there. And then also focus on progress, right? As opposed to a particular benchmark, I like to focus on progress. So in your conservation easement transaction, you have a baseline requirement. You have to go out and take a baseline. So when you're thinking about what type of management plan is effective on that particular project, make sure that you're going out and capturing the data that can be used as a baseline and putting it into your baseline document. And then focus on progress. At least my approach would be focus on progress in your management plan. Let's focus on, helping that farmer or that operator or that landowner understand additional management plans or slight tweaks to their current management plans that can make incremental progress towards the desired outcome of soil organic matter and all these other metrics that we know are part of soil health right now, without actually prescribing soil health. Soil organic matter must be 6%, and all these different actual hard metrics in there. I think that that's a much more a practical approach that could be monitored more effectively by the land trust. I think that's a huge consideration to make. What capacity do we have to monitor this? What's our willingness to actually enforce these provisions? The provision is only as good as our willingness to enforce it. So yeah, I'll leave it at that and go back to Allison.
Right. Allison?
Yeah, so we are really trying to kind of take this approach of having the plan be a collaborative document with the landowner, and to try to develop it in a way that it's something that the landowner will find useful for their operations. So we start out with a questionnaire that we've developed, where we ask the landowner to kind of talk about what they're currently doing and what their goals are, kind of overall for the farm. And then from that questionnaire, and I guess I should say that just as we have someone on staff who's used to write conservation plans for NRCS. So it's not me writing the plan, because that would be terrible. So she's pretty tapped into, the state resource concerns around the NRCS develops in states where we're working. And so she'll take that questionnaire and kind of develop the plan off of it. And she usually will list a series of practices that address soil health, both noting what the landowner's already doing and then kind of recommending management practices moving forward. But then part of what she writes up is, an explanation of why certain practices are being recommended. Like, why are we recommending cover crops and no-till? What is the benefit that gives to the farm? So, she's tying the plan then to resource concerns that the state NRCS office has identified. And so the plan itself generally includes practices that address not just soil health, but also, other concerns like water quality and quantity. So it's really trying to kind of look at the farm holistically and looking at not just the ag practices, but all of the uses, whether it's like riparian areas, any kind of use on the farm, and making recommendations based on the characteristics of the farm. So.
Okay, great. That is helpful. And at some point, I don't know if that AFT questionnaire is if that's something we can share, because if that is, it would be great if we could put that into the files section, just as a example. Before we move on, and we do need to, and I just think we could spend hours talking about management plans. But I am curious, obviously, the more, as folks think about moving into management plans and writing them, whether it's the land trust or the agency or working with the soil and water conservation district on those management plans, there are a lot of issues around capacity to write plans, capacity to steward then, and sort of particularly if you're going to require implementation with the management plan. And I'm just wondering that there will be an opportunity for a further smaller group conversation about this, but is there anybody who wants to offer up the approach that they're using as one that they think is good, or one that they have abandoned because it didn't work? Anybody want to offer up sort of a snapshot of what they're doing?
This is Tony at Groundswell Conservancy in Madison, Wisconsin. I can offer up a really bad experience. We had written into our farmland conservation easements, which date back to 1999, that NRCS drafts the farm conservation plans and or their designee. And they had chosen as their designee to write these plans the county that a lot of these projects are in. And the county, they had never actually written up a formal agreement. There was no paper trail for that. And the county decided their staff capacity was too low and they didn't want to do that anymore. And once I pointed that out, NRCS sort of pointed the finger back at me and said, you need to get this done. And that's not what's written into the conservation easement. So really bad experience, has taken a long time to have something done. We've talked in this group about NRCS staff capacity, and it took about 1.5 years, 2 years for them to find someone to write plans, to update plans where landowners had changed or the type of agriculture had changed. So I don't recommend going that way if you're in Wisconsin.
Okay, that is helpful. Well, let's I want to move on because I want to get to Jocelyn and Chad, but again, I think this is a conversation for this smaller group. When those who want to talk about management plans and approaches, we will talk more about that. But let's switch to Jocelyn and Chad, who again, and I think it was in part on thinking about sort of management plans, how prescriptive, and then whether there is sort of a value and a need for compensating landowners and producers for asking them to take on additional practices. So we were really lucky that that Jocelyn and not Chad, because he came later in the process, but MLT reached out to us and that we have been working with them on this project. But now let me just turn it over to the two of them to talk about the project and where they are on it. So Jocelyn and Chad.
So yeah, I'm Chad Kingstrom, obviously, as you see, joined by Jocelyn Walters-Hurd. I'm the program manager for Southwestern Minnesota. I've only been at the Land Trust for about 1 year, and so I came into this project when it was already it was 2 years into it, I think. We're in our 3rd year now. So my role, I have a background in farming, and so I was sort of put into the project when someone else left, but we have a small ag team now at the Land Trust. You can go to the next slide, please. Like a lot of land trusts, we have an interest in protecting farmland for a variety of reasons, as you can see there. Usually the way the Land Trust deals with agricultural lands is they're either cut out of the easement altogether, or they're included in the easement and designated as an agricultural use area where the Land Trust doesn't get involved with how that land is managed. We have suggestions and we have buffer requirements, but you know, the more conservation lands are protected better if we can improve farming practices on the ag lands as well. So we'll often have properties that have portions of farmland, and a lot of times it's the upland. So we have an interest in trying to get those farmlands protected, better farming practices, or even converted, you know, out of farmland altogether. I think internally, the Land Trust has been looking at how we can play a bigger role in the agricultural area. A lot of our easements have farmland associated with them. Like I said, we have about 70,000 acres protected, and quite a few of those, I don't know the number exactly, but it's probably at least half have some ag associated with it. So it's a big internal discussion about what our role can be and how we should deal with agriculture. And so this the project is called All Acres for Our Water. You can go to the next slide. This is a group. You can even jump to the next one if you want. Go ahead. I don't know if it's showing the whole. It looks like the slide. There it is. It took a second for those to show up, but it's a multifaceted approach to address water resource protection. It's been a really interesting group because as you can see, there's a long list of partners there. We have private funding for this project, which has leveraged a lot more money. Coming from a farming background myself, usually your co-op is who your ag retailer is, who your farmer often goes to for their seed and for their chemical treatment if they don't do it themselves. And you know, it's more common that you don't listen to your local soil and water conservation district. But in this case, with this project, the ag retailers, the local co-op, and the soil and water conservation district are all working really closely together, which makes for a really nice project. Farmers know that if they go to one or the other, they're going to kind of they're going to get the whole package. And there's a lot of resources available for farmers in this project area. If we can go to the next slide, it will show that project area. This is central Minnesota, a sub-watershed. You'll see there, this is the Bacchus Lake sub-watershed within the Sauk River watershed. So it's a really narrow area, and the funder really wanted us to sort of throw everything in the kitchen sink at a small area to see if we can move the needle on conservation. There's a lot of development pressure in this area. As you can see, it's the Twin Cities Metro to the southeast of that red star. And then St. Cloud is just to the east of that red star, which is another developing area. So you can go to the next slide. So like I said, it's a pilot program. The purpose is to try and improve water quality and soil health, primarily row crop and dairy farming in the area. While the dominant land use is agriculture, like I said, there's a lot of development pressure, a lot of various soil types, there's a lot of sand, there's some heavier ground in there as well. So really by focusing on this small area and directing a lot of resources in there, we're just trying to be, you know, like you said, a big part of a small thing. And in the end, we want something that we can, tools that we can use and feedback that we can take out and use just about anywhere. So that's the idea here. Next slide, please. So we have some tools that American Farmland Trust developed with us, and I would like to thank them because they were great, and we really leaned really heavily on them. My background is in farming, and so Ben was an amazing resource for us and everyone else. So the foundation of what we're trying to do here, and one thing I should say, and I should have done a slide with this, but keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is pay for the downstream benefits of in-field practice change. So we're not paying people to put in buffer strips. We're not paying for the tillage change. We're not paying for equipment in any way. What we're trying to do here is, based on this social cost of carbon, what is the benefit to making those changes downstream? So, and then trying to put a number on that. And you can see here, there's a lot of, as we know, there's a lot of negative impacts to putting carbon in the atmosphere. So the social cost of carbon is a big part of this. And this is a function, it's a number developed, US government uses it. That's the base of this ecosystem services valuation tool. We're not going to go into what the tool looks like itself. We don't have time. We might do it a little bit in the breakout, but you can go to the next slide here. Another part of this is water quality. Water quality is a big part of this. So water quality is a little bit harder to pin down because it's very local. You're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's sort of everywhere. You can quantify it, whereas water quality, the values are very locally specific. How do we really put a value on water quality? Is it visibility? Is it healthy shoreline? The tourism costs of good water versus bad? Minnesota, as we know, has a lot of lakes, and so water is a big deal here. So the water quality one was harder to pin down, but like I said, next slide, please. Thanks to Ben, especially, he developed this nice chart for us. So what we need to do is to get some values off the farm. And that's where these Comet tools come into play. Comet Planner and Comet Farm. Comet Planner is a really simple one where just a few clicks and you get some values kicked out as far as greenhouse gas reductions based on where you are and also the practice changes you're willing to implement. Comet Farm is very in-depth and it takes a long time, and we probably won't use it unless it's really important on a specific farm. But then the water tools on the bottom, watershed pollutant load reduction calculator, the nutrient tracking tool, and HSPF SAM, I think, is a more local Minnesota one. Those are other tools where we're taking on-farm data and getting values out based on practice change for water quality improvements. Then they're providing us a number of values. So Ben and AFT developed a tool where we take those values and put them into this other tool that give us monetary values based on the practice change. And those are based on existing programs. This is all backed up with current science. So we're not just pulling values out of thin air. It was really important for us to have something that can stand up to scrutiny. And we think that they did a really good job of that. So I'm going to stop because I think that's my last slide, and I'm going to let Jocelyn go from there. Next slide, please.
I'm Jocelyn Walters Hurd. I'm the senior staff attorney at the Minnesota Land Trust. And while I've been working on the All Acres project since its infancy, like Chris, my disclaimer is that I am a legal nerd. I don't claim to be an agricultural expert, but in any event, we will go through the legal instrument portion of this project. So in approaching this, we had to get a lay of the land, the landscape, in terms of farmland preservation efforts. And those range from less restrictive to more restrictive. And on the more restrictive end of things, we have addressing additional conservation and environmental objectives. And the goal here is to obtain conservation protection beyond the status quo and to address management decisions that protect and enhance the conservation values. The more controlled approach gets a land trust involved in some of the aspects of the farmers or ranchers' day-to-day operations. And this level of protection is often accomplished through a management or stewardship plan. These plans require time, resources, and expertise to create, monitor, and enforce the terms of these plans. And the Land Trust was up to that challenge. So that's the direction we decided to head in. But again, because of our lack of agricultural expertise, we enlisted the help of American Farmland Trust to help with developing the valuation tool, as well as the legal instrument. And they've been a terrific resource and partner. So on the front end of things, we looked at a variety of examples from other land trusts and governmental entities, including the Montana Land Reliance, the Vermont Land Trust, and Dakota County, which is a political subdivision here in Minnesota that does a lot of agricultural conservation easements. And we decided to go with a more controlled, restrictive approach to protect and enhance water quality, soil health, ensure carbon sequestration, while also giving the landowner environmentally sound options and when it comes to their day-to-day operations. You can go to the next slide, please. And as Chris Coffin refers to it, we went with a stacked approach, which consists of a triad of documents. We have as the foundation of the legal instrument, the conservation easement. We used our conservation easement template for natural habitat and gave it more of an agricultural flair. We also have an agricultural practices management plan. And then on top of that, we have an agricultural practices management plan contract. Next slide, please. So with regard to the conservation easement in general, like our traditional natural habitat easement, this imposes certain negative covenants prohibiting uses and activities which are inconsistent with the conservation values of the protected property as of the grant of the easement. And as far as the agricultural use goes, the easement explicitly addresses a few items. One, the agricultural use area. So we prescribe the size and the location of the agricultural use, the types of use, which are pretty broad types of agricultural use, but feedlots, for instance, are prohibited. We do have buffer requirements written into the conservation easement, in terms of the agricultural uses, proximity to wetlands, bodies of water, and other ecologically sensitive areas. So that is baked in forever. And it also provides that any agricultural use must be conducted pursuant to an agricultural practices management plan. Next slide, please. So in contrast to the easement, the management plan is intended to provide an affirmative obligation of the owner to attempt to implement the best agricultural management practices as understood at the time the plan is adopted or amended, and to the extent deemed advisable by both the owner and the land trust. So at a minimum, the management plan has to consider these items: agricultural soils, management and enhancement, non-productive land, including field edges, wetlands, scrub and shrub areas, land under and around structures, access roads, weed, invasive and pest management, water resources, including soil water retention, irrigation water management, drainage management and improvement, wildlife habitat and biodiversity, crop placement and rotation as applicable to the type of use, grazing management, again, as applicable to the type of use and forested areas. Next slide, please. So the various environmentally sound practices that are prescribed are broken into required practices and recommended practices based on, looking at the property and the context of the property. A variety of facts considered include land cover, current land use, desired land use, adjacent wetlands and bodies of water, adjacent natural habitat, etc. The management plan generally lasts 10 years unless it needs to be modified, amended, or updated at an earlier point. And buyers and lessees are subject to the management plan or need to complete an updated plan that is just as protective as the existing plan. So the initial plan is always going to create that floor in terms of protection of the conservation values. And the management plan indicates which practices, both required and recommended, may be eligible for payment under the agricultural land management plan contract. Next slide, please. So this is where the ecosystem services valuation tool comes into play. While the conservation easement, we're able to use a traditional appraisal to come up with a purchase price for that. The management plan contract is like the icing on the cake for landowners and also the land trust. Under the contract, the landowner implements certain specific agricultural management practices intended to produce or realize certain ecosystem services. And without getting into the weeds too much here, required practices provide primary, what we're terming primary ecosystem services. And the landowner agrees to produce or realize primary ecosystem services by implementing and maintaining those required practices. The recommended practices provide additional ecosystem services, and the landowner may elect to produce or realize one or more of the additional ecosystem services by implementing or maintaining recommended practices. So the ecosystem services, both primary and additional, are expected to be produced through the implementation of the practices, and those are going to be estimates. So MLT estimates the ecosystem services using the valuation tool, which, as Chad mentioned, incorporates other environmental modeling and quantification tools to come up with a number. The estimates are made at the date of the agreement, the executed agreement. The payment amount is determined by Minnesota Land Trust in its sole discretion based on the estimates of the ecosystem services. The payment schedule is something we haven't quite figured out yet, but we need to structure it in a way that satisfies the landowner's needs, creates an incentive, while also ensures that these practices are actually implemented. And then as far as monitoring this contract, right now what we're thinking is to receive payments, we will require annual statements from the landowner certifying implementation of the practices and other documentation depending on the land use, the agricultural types of use. And also the land trust and its agents and contractors will have the right to enter the property to monitor it in person or via drones or satellite imagery to ensure that the practices are being implemented. Next slide, please. So this is just a broad overview of where we're at in our timeline for this project. In this next, we're in year 4, and right now we're working on conducting outreach to enlist 3 to 5 farmers to test out the valuation tool, test out the legal instruments, obtain data that will help us further develop and refine the valuation tool and legal instruments to get a sense of whether landowners are actually interested in this and if this could produce the results that we're hoping it will. And then once we gather all of this information in the spring, we will come together as an organization and talk about how and if we will incorporate these measures into our current programs or whether we want to pursue a new strategic initiative based on agriculture. Next slide, please. So admittedly, we don't have it all figured out, of course. AFT is helping us along the way. And these are the terms, conditions, and logistics that are still in progress, amongst others. We have to figure out who it is that's going to develop, approve, serve as a consultant of the initial management plan. Is that going to be the landowner that develops it and the land trust approves? Do the landowner and the Minnesota Land Trust want to agree on a qualified technical service provider to develop the plan, or a certified conservation planner? We haven't quite worked that out. We have, in the same line, we have to figure out whether we want to develop the expertise in-house, or whether we will rely on contractors and consultants outside of the organization to help in developing these plans and monitoring the plans. Again, we have to figure out the best payment structure approach. And we're looking into what are the triggers and conditions that would lead to a plan and or contract amendment modification. And again, the monitoring enforcement piece, will the land trust have the expertise in order to monitor and enforce the practices prescribed in the plan and required under the contract, or would we have to outsource that? And then as far as the additional recommended practices and additional ecosystem services go, we're thinking about building in a funding contingency for that, because we won't necessarily have that earmarked at the time of the conservation easement. Next slide, please. And these are the unanswered questions that we'll leave everyone with, just to run through them quickly. Is there a market for this tool? Are landowners actually going to willingly and voluntarily sign on to this? Who is our target audience? Do we want to focus on farmers who are already environmentally inclined and conscious, or do we want to focus on those farmers who have a lot of work to do that we can assist in getting that off the ground? What are the available sources of funding for the conservation easement? In the same line, are there separate sources of funding available to pay for the ecosystem services that will be on top of the standard appraisal? How do we deal with carbon rights and development rights? Because we're arguably paying for the sequestration of carbon under the valuation tool, are the carbon rights associated with the property terminated? The same goes with development rights. And, are we able to reward early adopters through this tool? Early adopters usually get left in the dust and don't have any rewards for the work that they've done. So we have to figure out if this is something that we want to reward them for their early work or not. And again, how can the land trust best utilize this tool? Will this be supplemental to our conservation easement work with natural habitats? Would this be its own agricultural program, considering the fact that half of Minnesota is agricultural land? And what is our capacity restraints in implementing this tool? Is it appropriate for the land trust to use, or would it be better used by a government entity like a county or the state? And the big question is this tool going to actually do what we want it to do? Improve water quality, soil health, protect natural habitat, and sequester carbon. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand it back to Chris.
Great, thank you so much. And Jamie, I think you can, there we go, beautiful. I suspect that people have lots of questions and lots of thoughts about that approach. And I think I'm going to call an audible here. And this is particularly relevant for Jean. Originally, we were going to stay in this full session and let Jean talk about conservation planning. I think that what we should do instead is to, given that so that we can have close to a half an hour, is to break out into the discussion groups. So again, Allison and Chris are going to lead one discussion, but it's really a discussion. It's sort of, we want people to be talking about approaches on the management plans at front, and what particularly related to soil health and what are the challenges in thinking about management plans.